Okay, so first of all, to everybody, welcome to the second seminar in the ISGAP seminar series of East and Southeast Asia in Comparative Perspectives. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Meron Medzini, who is going to be speaking about Jewish communities in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, and Myanmar. We are very lucky to have Professor Medzini with us to give you some information about his very impressive background. He was born in Jerusalem and received his PhD at Harvard in East Asian languages and civilizations. After a 20-year government service, during which time he served as spokesman for Israeli Prime Ministers Levi Eshkol, Golda Meir, and Yitzhak Rabin, he taught for many years modern Japanese history and Far Eastern international relations at the Hebrew University. He is the author of 9 books and scores of articles published in Israel and abroad. His book, Japan and the Jews During the Holocaust Era, was recently translated to Japanese. And in 2016, he was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun by the Japanese government for promoting Israel and Japan cultural relations. He currently resides in Jerusalem. So thank you very much for your time, for your generous time, Professor Medzini, and I look forward to your talk, which will be for around 30 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A session for people. And in the meantime, if you think of any questions, you're very welcome to type them in the Zoom group. Okay, thank you, Professor Medzini.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ainslie. Good morning, America. Good afternoon, Europe. Good night, China. From Jerusalem. Before I delve into the subject, a few words about my competence in this business. I became interested in Asia many years ago because my father was born in Siberia but lived in China in Harbin for 4 years. And after the Russian Revolution, he escaped from Russia, ended up in Manchuria, and then lived a year in Japan before coming to this country about 100 years ago. So he was the first one who attracted my interest to Asia. Years later, I worked for an international Jewish organization raising funds, and that East Asia and Southeast Asia was part of my territory. So I used to travel quite often to the area, and I looked at the story a bit more carefully when I did a book on Japan and the Jews during the Holocaust, as you mentioned. So here are some of my random thoughts. When we look at Jewish communities, especially in remote areas, we have to ask 5 questions. First is, where did they come from? Why did they go to wherever they went? What they do? Did they have any impact on the environment, on the surrounding area? And finally, what happened to them? In order to make life easy, I divide the subject into 5 waves of Jewish settlement in the countries that we're going to discuss. The first wave starts basically after the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the beginning of European colonization of Southeast Asia, the opening of China, Opium War, 1842, Treaty of Nanjing, opening of Japan, 1853-54, the arrival of the French in the 1840s in Indochina. The Dutch were settled earlier in Indonesia, the British in Singapore from 1819, in Malaya, and of course in Burma. So Jews followed some of these colonial powers. They came from a number of directions. The first and foremost were Jews from the Middle East, predominantly Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, who started coming in the 1830s, 1840s, drawn predominantly by business, by family connections, some of them a sense of adventure, many of them because somebody went to, let's say, Singapore or Batavia or in other places, Shanghai, Hong Kong, sent letters saying this is a good place, there are opportunities for business, come and settle. So the original settlers, they're known in Jewish history as the Baghdadis, came from the Middle East via India, and then down to Singapore, and from there on, after the Treaty of Nanjing, to Shanghai and the other 5 port cities opened up in China, and later on in Japan. A tiny number of Jews came to the Philippines after the American takeover, and there were, interestingly enough, there were no Jewish communities until 1945 in Korea and Taiwan. For a very simple reason, Japanese government did not allow foreigners to come. And therefore, you have no Jewish presence in these countries. The numbers were tiny, and they engaged predominantly in trading. In the case of Singapore, Jews started going into real estate. In one of the reports at some point in the 1850s, 60s, about a third of the land in the island of Singapore was owned by a Jewish family, Menashe Meir. Descendants are still around. And in other places, Jews began to work for the colonial administration. For example, in the case of France, the French arrived in Indochina in the 1840s. A number of Jews came with the French colonial administration. Later on, there were traders. In the case of Indonesia, same thing. I think there were a number of Jews in Penang who were also involved in British colonial administration. But the majority were traders, and they really didn't have any great impact because of a very simple thing. They were seen as foreigners. They were not seen specifically as Jews. Another Christian sect of one sort or another, but interestingly enough, the Jews prayed on Saturday, they prayed in their own synagogue, and they demanded a special burial site. Apart from that, they were seen as part of the foreign community, and they acted in the same manner. When Jewish communities begin to arise in a certain area, they immediately look for 3 or 4 communal organization institutions. The first thing is the synagogue. The second is a burial site. The third are schools. The fourth are certain rituals such as circumcision, kosher food that has to be provided, and therefore, in fact, our knowledge of Jewish communities derives partly from grave sites. We know how many and who were they, what are the dates of their birth and death. They had no impact on the surrounding general community for a very simple reason: they did not speak the local language. And therefore, they could not be involved in media, in academia, certainly not in politics. They were basically focused on business, and not even in banking, predominantly as traders. There is, in these 4 countries, there is one Jewish name that is involved in politics that came in 1950s, and that was David Marshall, who was born David Mash'al, who was chief minister in Singapore. In fact, he was the first one in the 1950s before he was replaced by Lee Kuan Yew. The first wave begins to establish synagogues. Magen Avot in Waterloo Road in Singapore, 1878, Matzmiach Yeshua in Myanmar. I'm not aware of any synagogue that survives to this very day in Hanoi or in Saigon. there was a small synagogue in Bangkok as well. The second wave. After the first Russian Revolution, 1905, a number of Russian Jews escape. They are also escaping pogroms in Russia from 1903, 1904, and a number of them make their way to East Asia, curiously enough, because the Russian Tsar was interested in getting more and more Russians to settle in Manchuria, partly because of the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. And therefore you have a number of Russian Jews who begin to spread out. Very few of them come to Indochina. Some begin to go to Thailand. I'm not aware of any who ended up in Penang or in Singapore or in Myanmar or in Burma. Now, Russian Jews usually gravitate to where there are other Russian speakers. It makes life easier for them, and there is a community that is prepared to assist. The third wave, and that is a large wave after the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917. A large number of Russian Jews are fleeing not only Bolshevik Revolution, but also a civil war in Russia and pogroms, especially in the Ukraine, 1919, 1920. They make their way east, some of them, and end up in Thailand, for example. I'm not aware of Russian Jews really going to Singapore or Penang or to Indochina. The majority of them, by the way, end up in Manchuria, and some go to Shanghai. The policy of the Thai government regarding the immigration of foreigners was quite restrictive. Basically, they didn't like foreigners. They were afraid of foreigners. I think at the end of the 19th century, there were about 1,200 foreigners living in Thailand, mostly in Bangkok at the time, and they were not very happy. They were afraid of foreign influences, all sorts of evil ideas and ideologies being brought in by these foreigners. This was, by the way, specifically evident in Japan. The next wave, 1933, the rise of Nazi Germany. And German Jews begin to look for places to escape. Most of the world is closed, specifically America. Palestine is still open until 1939. And those who wish to go to Asia found haven predominantly in Shanghai. For a very simple reason, you didn't need a visa to land in Shanghai. You arrived, and because of the special arrangements in Shanghai, the French concession and the international community, you could land in Shanghai, and therefore quite a few thousands of German Jews ended up in China. Some went to Thailand. One I remember specifically, he was an eye doctor, Jacobson, who opened a clinic to treat the blind in Bangkok. The German Jews, the same thing, did not bother to learn the local language, and therefore didn't play any major role in the politics, in university life, in media, in underground movements, in communism, socialism, in these 4 specific countries. What happens to them during the Second World War? Apart from Thailand and Indochina, Burma was run over by the Japanese, or most of it. Singapore fell in February 1942. Indochina ended up being a French colony subject to the Vichy regime. And therefore, what the colonial regime did was to impose on the Jews who lived there, and there were probably over 1,500 Jews living mostly in Hanoi and Saigon. At the time, they imposed on them what is known as Statut des Juifs, the statutes, anti-Semitic statutes against Jews, which were proclaimed by the Pétain regime in Vichy after the fall of France, specifically under the Governor General, the French Admiral Admiral Decoux. And therefore, Jews were thrown out of teaching positions, but mostly out of media to the extent that they were involved, government positions, the army, anything that had to do with public administration, public life. Jews were thrown out. But apart from that, they were not molested. They were not put into camps because theoretically, Indochina remained a colony. And although the laws were against the Jews, but there were no camps in the place. The bulk of Jews in Myanmar fled as the Japanese were advancing. Most of those who ran away either went to India or ended up outside Rangoon, and therefore they survived. The Japanese really didn't bother with the Jews, apart from those who held specifically British or American passports. They were therefore enemy nationals, therefore they were put in some sort of a prison. But the bulk of the Jews in Myanmar just left the country, and I think there were about 200 Jews who remained in Myanmar at the end of the war. In Singapore, the picture was different. There were about 1,000 Jews when the Japanese arrived in early 1942. They were asked to register and separated between those who held British American passports, they were enemy nationals, and those who had other passports. Curiously enough, the Japanese did not go after the Iraqi Jews. Iraq was considered at the time friendly enemy country. This is a nice term. Japanese were interested in seeking the support of Muslims, especially in India. And therefore they were seen as Jews from Arab countries. They were not really molested, but those holding enemy passports were imprisoned in Changi, which is where the international airport is today in Singapore. Others were lost their property and bank accounts, and some had to give up their jewelry. Persecution really began after the Nazi Germans arrived, I think in 1943. They arrived not only in Singapore, but also in Penang. I think Penang became a submarine base for German U-boats to the extent that they operated in the Indian Ocean. And a number of Jews were put in camps, initially hounded by the Japanese secret police. Thailand, of course, remained outside the war, although formally Thailand declared war on the Allies a day after Pearl Harbor, but nobody took that very seriously. And therefore, the Jews in Thailand during the war were not molested, were not in any way persecuted. The Jews in Indonesia, there were about 3,000 of them, were put in camps, and many of them stayed in camps until the very end of the war. At the end of the war, many of those who left and went to India or to Australia or to other places went back to Myanmar, to Singapore. Very few ended up in Thailand. Many of the Jews who lived in Indochina left, and the majority of them left when the French disappeared from Indochina after the defeat in Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And there were virtually no Jews left in Indochina until the arrival of the Israelis. The fifth wave, which started in the 1980s, consists predominantly of Israelis. And they now form probably the backbone of the Jewish communities in these countries. Where'd they go? Partly adventure. Very interesting point in the case of young Israelis, after they finish their army service, there was almost the obligatory overseas trip. When I left the army in 1954, it was Europe. When my children left the army, I've got four. One decided to go to Costa Rica and Guatemala. I don't know why. Three went to Asia. I know very well because I paid for the trips. And thousands of Israelis who leave the army make their way to Southeast Asia and Far East. And the starting point is either India or Bangkok. And therefore, they discovered Asia. And many of them, they don't stay for a day or 2 or 3 days, they stay for months. And many were attracted. New culture, new civilization, new way of life, life without military reserve, without wars, without borders, without Palestinians. In other words, totally new way of looking at things, far more laid back. And many of them came back and enrolled in the newly opened departments of Asian Studies, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Tel Hai. Many of them by students. The difference now is that some of them speak the language. At least they know what to expect. And they were drawn to Asia, specifically after the establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and India and China, which happened the same week in January 1992, after the first Gulf War. And since then, Jews began to, predominantly Israelis, began to move in large numbers to these countries, apart from Myanmar. Now, it's extremely interesting. Myanmar and Israel were very friendly in 1953, 4, 5, 6, until the military takeover. The first Asian prime minister, I think first prime minister ever to visit Israel in 1955 was the prime minister of Burma. And Ben-Gurion reciprocated. In fact, spent a week in some monastery in Burma at the time. There were very friendly relations. But then came military takeover, and very few Israelis wanted to go to Myanmar. Vietnam attracted and attracts more and more Israelis. My own account is at least 1,000. More or less equally divided between Hanoi and Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. One example, an Israeli runs 2 hospitals. And many of them are involved in advising the government of Vietnam, especially in irrigation, agricultural development, and other high-tech things. In Thailand, you have an amazing phenomena of retired Israelis. Apparently, there is a law in Thailand which enables people with means to stay as long as they want. And I encountered quite a few retired Israelis in their 50s, 60s, who live like kings because they get Social Security in Israel, they get their pension, and they rent out their flats in Israel. And there were one of them said to me, look, I'm starting out with about $3,000, $4,000 a month, and I can live like a king in Thailand. You find them in Phuket, you find them in Pattaya, you find some of them in Bangkok. But many of them are involved in trade as representative of Israeli companies. Of these 4 countries, the largest batch of Israelis is in Singapore. Singapore is the headquarters of quite a few international Israeli companies, which are trading with Southeast Asia. And it's relatively easy because the spoken language is English and they know English. And therefore it's easy. Israel also has special ties with Singapore. The Israeli army trained Singaporean army. Initially it was a secret arrangement, then it was open. And therefore Singapore is very, very popular, probably the most important community where we have. There are no Jews, to my knowledge, in Indonesia. There are Israelis who travel as tourists. You can go, and in fact, there were secret relations. There are secret ties between Israel and Indonesia. In fact, Israel sold Indonesia a number of weapons that we no longer needed. The same applies to Malaysia, where formally Malaysia is very hostile to Israel, but informally there are some connections, usually through the embassy in Singapore. So the majority of these Jews are involved in trade. And here there is an interesting phenomenon, and I asked quite a few of them, what do you do for to remain Jewish? Well, they say in every place there is Chabad. Chabad is a Jewish outfit. I call them the Jewish Jesuits. And they have synagogues in virtually every community, in all countries in the Far East, apart from Malaysia and Muslim countries and Indonesia and Bangladesh. They provide meals, they provide schools, they provide a synagogue, they provide kosher food. They will get you a man to circumcise your boys if need be. And they are very popular, and therefore you can remain a Jew wherever you are. If you're in Chiang Mai or Pattaya or in Phuket, and certainly in Bangkok. The second very important point is the easy connection with home. There were, until the COVID, 20 flights a week from Israel to China. There are daily flights to Bangkok. And therefore, it's relatively easy to fly and to travel. More recently, last year, Israel entered into diplomatic relations with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain. And therefore, one easy way to get to Southeast Asia today is to fly to Abu Dhabi or Dubai or Doha and get on an Emirates flight or Gulf Air and carry on, which saves you time and money, because you can fly over Saudi Arabia, over Jordan. The third easy way to connect, to remain constantly in touch with home is Zoom, is Skype, is WhatsApp, all the modern technology. And therefore, people tell me, I talk to home virtually every day. So you don't have the feeling of isolation, of loneliness, which you had, let's say, 100 years ago, or even before that. I assume that Jews will continue to play a role, but once again, apart from mashal, and even though there is growing number of intermarriages, in other words, Israelis marrying local brides, they are not involved in politics. Very few of them are in the professions, such as medicine, law, accountancy, which are traditional Jewish professions, of course. You don't have that phenomena in East Asia, and therefore most of them are really traders. And I assume the numbers will grow. There has been some sort of freeze in all this because of the pandemic, but that doesn't mean that it will not resume. Tourism is, by the way, resuming to Israel next week. November 1, we're opening up to all those who have the vaccination, 2 or 3, and even those who have the Sputnik vaccination. We now recognize that. That's a gift to the Russians. So I assume pretty soon we'll be able to get back to Southeast Asia, and which means that more and more young Israelis will go to these countries. Some of them eventually even may settle there. I think I'll hold my peace at this point and invite your comments and questions.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Medzini. I just learned an enormous amount about Judaism in Southeast Asia. And there were quite a few points you raised that I feel like I know Southeast Asia and its history quite well, but there was a lot I just learned right then that I didn't know. And I was amazed to learn about the impact of Judaism in Singapore historically. Did you say that, was it a third of land in Singapore at one point? Was
third of the land, a third of the land was owned by the Meyer family. Mm-hmm. And unlike in other places, Jews were involved in local administration, city council, for example. Mm-hmm. They joined the, I think there was not an army, but there was some sort of local defense force before Pearl Harbor, and they were partly involved in that. But then came David Marshall.
Mm-hmm. Sure. That's fascinating. I really didn't know it was that significant, that huge. Thank you for that. I know that I'm sure that there will be a couple of people who have questions, and please do, start writing your questions. I'm going to invoke kind of chair's privilege because I actually have a few that I hope you don't mind if I ask after that speech, because I was very intrigued by a lot of it. My first is basically I wanted to know how difficult is it to trace the origins of these various communities at the different historical times, because you mentioned the various waves and you were quite specific about where they went, because in the waves this was very, very different. What is the actual best way to do this? Like, how do you trace this movement over these different periods? You mentioned certainly synagogues and graveyards, but are there any other historical kind of clues and links, and what evidence do you use to be able to plot this?
Apart from a Jewish newspaper that appeared in Shanghai for years, it was called the Jewish Messenger. Mm-hmm. I am not aware that other Jewish communities really had their own newspapers, and therefore it's quite difficult. Although in recent years there is somebody who in Hong Kong who produces material. It was a monthly. I haven't seen it for a while. I'm not sure if he's continuing. Oh, there you get news about Jewish communities in Asia. Apart from that, I cannot really mention.
Sure.
Which other sources?
One area I was told about that people can trace is the various family names. So you can tell where particular families might have come from in the world at certain times.
Yes, because these in Singapore, these are not Chinese names, obviously. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there would be foreign names, and there are certain specific Jewish Iraqi names or Iranian names: Levi, Cohen, Gubai, Kaduri, Sassoon, Hardun, Elias, Meir, that are specifically Jewish. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Another question I had, if I may, was also, which is the community in Southeast Asia that we know the least about? Because you mentioned the sort of the levels of information we had. So you're quite specific about Vietnam at a certain time and about Singapore. What's the one that we know the least about?
I think Penang.
Okay.
In Malaysia. Mm-hmm. I think there is a burial site there, and the Jews were told, in fact, when the Japanese launched the war I think it was the British who told the Jews get out and
Mm-hmm.
leave Penang. I think there were about 70 or 80 Jews in Penang at the time, and therefore it's very difficult to trace them.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
my own investigations, it's easy in Taiwan because it starts in 45, South Korea 45, Japan goes back to about 18 after the opening of Japan. Three major communities: Nagasaki, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kobe. In the Philippines, there were some conversos, there were some converted Jews after the Spanish Inquisition, Pinto, Mendez, but then the majority came after the American takeover in the end of 19th century. The last Jew left Indonesia, by the way, about 2 or 3 years ago, in a place called Surabaya. Not Jakarta, but Surabaya. There was a synagogue there. And another curious thing, the last remaining Jew in Afghanistan left Afghanistan about 3 weeks ago.
I read about this story. It's quite incredible.
And he refused to go because he didn't want to give divorce papers to his wife, who lives in Israel. 20 years he kept her on leash. Finally, he was persuaded to go. I'm not sure where he is now. So therefore, yeah, Afghanistan is I hate to use the German term, is Judenrein, no Jews. Jews do not live in Muslim countries. I don't really believe there are any Jews, apart maybe diplomats and some traders, in Bangladesh. Now, Pakistan has been, behind the scenes, quite helpful to Jews. For example, when Jews began fleeing Iran after the onset of the Khomeini regime, well, the way to go is via Pakistan. And they were helpful. Also helpful in case of Afghanistan. But formally, of course, Pakistan is hostile to Israel.
Sure. I'm just going to jump in because we have a few comments actually about the Penang cemetery that I've also been to myself when I lived in Malaysia, and somebody is saying that they saw that cemetery about a decade ago. It was being looked after well by a Hindu man. Yes, I also remember there was an Indian man who was taking care of it. What I do know recently is actually it has been kind of cleaned up quite a bit, and there has been a sort of increased interest in the history of this cemetery. So we hope that continues. I'd like to sort of continue with my line of questioning. Thank you for answering my questions so far. I'm interested sort of when you talked about the sort of earlier waves, you mentioned how sort of the Jewish communities were somewhat indistinguishable from sort of other foreign groups, or by the local populations, they were seen as being sort of just another group of foreigners, basically. But were they sort of different to the colonialists, because the European colonialists would have brought their sort of anti-Semitism with them, and they would have been maybe treating Jewish people not that very good. Would there have been any impact on the relationship between the local population and the Jewish groups at all?
I'm not aware of anti-Semitism among the local population. I assume there were a number of anti-Semitic cases in Indochina when the French were there, but then the Jews were seen as French. They spoke the language. They came with the administration. There were a number of anti-Semitic incidents in Indonesia because of the Dutch. I don't know if did Rothem Kovner discuss when he talked to you last time? Did he talk about Jews in Indonesia? He made a big research on it.
Yeah, I'm aware of his research. It's very impressive.
For example, when Jews were interned in Indonesia, it was non-Jews who insisted that the Jews be interned in separate parts of a given camp, so they wouldn't mix. And therefore, you had a Jewish section of a given camp and the other non-Jews in that particular camp. I'm not aware that there was anti-Semitism among the Chinese, Muslims, Indians in Singapore or in Thailand.
We're actually on that subject. People are actually mentioning in the comments there that there was an attack on a synagogue in Singapore this year, which is the first I've heard about, which is very unfortunate.
I did not hear about it. It could be. Look, we're speaking about the present situation.
Yeah, yeah.
Most of these countries vote against Israel at the UN. Almost as a group, they're part of the non-aligned nations. And when Israel complains, why are you voting against us? The answer essentially is, first of all, who cares? The UN is not that important. And you are the last ones who should be worried about the UN. Secondly, they say, we vote as a bloc, as a group. Thirdly, they say, our policy towards Israel is separate from our policy regarding Palestinians. We believe the Palestinians have certain rights and so on. Most of them will go for the two-state solution. But that does not in any way preclude our contacts and ties with Israel, because Israel provides us with a great deal of military, economic, technological, agricultural assistance and know-how and so on. Same applies, by the way, to China, the same thing.
We have another question that certainly interests me, saying, do you have historical information about Jews in Cambodia? It's one country we haven't mentioned. Do we have any information about this?
I do not. I was once in Phnom Penh years ago. There was nothing there. I think there was one Jew from France, and then that's it. I am not aware that there is a synagogue, probably Chabad, because Israelis visit. I wouldn't be surprised, for example, if there's Chabad in the city next to the Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom and Bayou and so on, where all the tourists go. I'm not aware of Jews in Laos, Vietnam. Not aware. I haven't been there. I don't know.
Thank you. I have another question, which is, I think, a topic that interests me quite a bit, and one of my colleagues, Dr. Corey Schultz, will actually be talking about this topic in a few weeks on this seminar. And this is kind of the relationship between sort of indigenous Judaism within these countries, sort of in this historical communities, and then this diasporic, largely Israeli sort of, not necessarily diasporic, but the kind of Israeli version, modern Judaism that comes into these countries in the final wave of what you were talking about right at the end. I was kind of interested in what is the relationship between these sort of very different models of sort of Judaism. What sort of happens when they meet? Because we've got kind of very different practices, we've got different histories, and we've also got different attitudes from the governments within the region towards sort of local ethnic minorities, and then kind of foreigners who come in as tourists and bring money, etc. So is there a conflict? What happens when these different traditions, these different constructions meet?
Much depends on the Israelis who come. Are they Ashkenazi or Sephardi? Are they religious in any way? In other words, practicing Jews which means kosher food, so the Friday rituals, holidays, synagogue, Shabbat, and so on? Or are they secular? The secular tend to shun away from the Jewish community. The Mizrahim, the Sephardic Orthodox, will certainly establish very, very close contact with the local Jewish community. because they want to celebrate with them. Friday evening, synagogue, Shabbat, Jewish holidays, kosher food, to the extent that there is a school there. In most of these places, there are no Jewish schools. Jews send their children to international schools. So that depends predominantly on the Israelis who come, what is their own background. There are certain times when all the community, entire community gets together. And that's Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, New Year's, Passover, the Seder, Israelis will go, and Israel Independence Day. Israel Independence Day is now being celebrated by the entire Jewish community, local Israelis, whoever is there, will celebrate either at the Israeli embassy and increasingly you have even Israeli Memorial Day, which is the day preceding Israeli Independence Day. There, the entire community will come together. And that's a new situation, new phenomenon. And that applies, by the way, to China. It applies to worldwide, I imagine.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Thank you. We have one question here that asks, why is Hitler so popular in Thailand? Sort of, I guess, Hitler and Nazi iconography. I've also seen that. I lived in Thailand for many years.
I cannot explain. I have no idea why he is popular. By the way, he's popular not only in Thailand. Mm-hmm. There is a revival of admiration for Hitler in Europe as well. Mm-hmm. But why specifically? I'm aware of the incidents that they were there. There was once an incident in Taiwan where somebody drew a swastika and they didn't have a clue what they were doing. It really represented complaints. What are you doing? Swastika. We didn't know what it was. And obviously they they removed it immediately.
Sure. I mean, I guess in the first place, this iconography was designed to be attractive to people. So ultimately, if you're not aware of the connotations and the history behind that, maybe it still works in some ways. Yeah. And a lot of these countries do also practice racial politics and racial divisions too.
Yeah, you would know. In China and Japan, by the way, in China, Jews are not recognized as a separate religious sect, not one of the five. In Japan, there were, in the 20s and 30s, there was anti-Semitism, not street anti-Semitism.
What do you mean by that, not street anti-Semitism?
Street anti-Semitism means attacking Jews, attacking synagogues. What you see now in the streets of Brooklyn, or shooting at Jewish synagogues like you had in Pittsburgh 2-3 years ago. You did not have, because Japanese, most of them never saw a Jew in their life. But where did anti-Semitism arrive in Japan? Through white Russians fleeing the Russian Revolution, blaming all the ills of the Russian Revolution on Jews. And a Japanese officer translated the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it made its way to Japan in 1923. You may know Professor Shiloni, my colleague here in Jerusalem, who is our leading Japanologist. Years ago, he told me, years ago, a Japanese delegation arrived and they gave him a gift, which they thought was very appropriate. And that was a Japanese translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And they were very serious about it. They said, it's forgery. It's hoax. And they were offended and they brought something which was fake. But it's still in the 80s in Japan, there was Holocaust denial. I'm not aware there's Holocaust denial in other countries. Mainly, bear in mind, no one apart from Europe knew about the Holocaust. Japanese first heard about the Holocaust 10 years later when the diaries of Anne Frank were published in Japanese. They didn't have a clue about it. Chinese certainly didn't know, or others in that region. Part of it, by the way, was the Americans. In Japan, the Americans did not want the Holocaust to be known. Otherwise, they would have been asked, why did you close the gates to the Jews?
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't want to bother with that. So you have there amazing phenomena.
We have, there's another question that I just missed earlier on. And I think we've possibly gone over some of this already, but perhaps you have something to add to it. I'll read it out. Dr. Medzini, you spoke about how the Jewish communities remained Jewish as they settled across these different communities. What do you think are some of the key differences between Jewish communities settling in the West and those in Asia, especially Southeast Asia? Do you see a change in how they've integrated culturally or socially? If so, how has their Jewish identity evolved? I think that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, there is an enormous difference between Jews in the West and Jews in the East. Has to do partly with the religious traditions in Asia, Buddhism, in case of Japan, Shintoism, in case of some countries in Asia, Islam. But above all, in the West, Jews spoke the language, and Jews lived there for centuries, and Jews played, and still do, a very, very considerable role in academia, in media, in banking, in politics, in trade unions, what not. I mean, Hollywood, this is a Jewish business, if I can be crude to say that. And who discovered it for the first time? The Japanese. When did they discover this? In 1905, when they were fighting the Russians and they ran out of money and they needed loans. And by sheer coincidence, the deputy head of the Bank of Japan, Takahashi, was sitting in a dinner party in London with a Jewish banker from New York, Jacob Schiff, who hated the Russians because of the pogroms. And Schiff organized two consortiums. And they lent Japan, I think it was about 100 million sterling at the time, 1905, that's a hell of a lot of money. And that allowed Japan to survive. Who did Schiff go to get the money? To Lehman Brothers and Warburg and Sachs and Goldman, not exactly Chinese names. Otherwise, they went to the Jews. And the impression was that Jews control international finance and banking. So you have in the West, the Jews play a far more prominent role than, hang on just one moment. I need to zoom. Sorry, a far more prominent role. Then look, you have, I was in Japan once years ago when there was a serious problem with economic conflict between, was the Clinton administration. And a delegation arrived from the United States to Japan. The delegation consisted of Secretary of Treasury Rubin, Trade Commissioner Rivlin, somebody other involved, Cantor. And one Japanese said to me, don't they have others? Which theoretically is anti-Semitic, but these were Jews. So Jews have a very, very prominent role in all these countries. Take the Russian Revolution, apart from Stalin and Molotov, I don't know, Lenin, all the other leaders were Jews, from Trotsky down, certainly.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of the lecture now, but we have kind of one sort of final question here, who is saying, thank you very much for your interesting lecture. Is it possible to explore more about anti-Semitism and the Vichy regime in Indonesia, especially in Cambodia? I mean, we've already said that we're not sure about Cambodia in essence, but
I'm not sure about Cambodia. In Indochina, yes.
Indochina,
yes.
yeah.
Yes, there is a great deal of material, especially in France, in the various archives in France. And this has been done, by the way. This has been done by a number of authors, not specifically in Indochina, but in the French colonies that came under the Vichy regime. Because you have documents. I found some documents in Hanoi and some archives, but mostly in France. And all these things are available. The Governor General, Admiral Decoux, was put on trial at the end of the war.
When did you conduct this research? This is fascinating.
The last time I was in Hanoi was 2.5 or 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And
So you're still incredibly
still a lot of work to do.
I'm sure that you have not yet finished yet. There is more.
I have a minor problem. I'm going to be 90 soon. I'm not sure how long I'll be able to move about, but that keeps me going.
I'm extremely inspired by this lecture and by the stories that you're telling and the information that you've uncovered. So I think that's. Will you be 90 soon?
90. No, that's not exaggerate. 90. In about 9 months.
Goodness me. It's extremely impressive. I can only hope that I can get to that age and be unbelievably on the ball as you are.
I said to a friend of mine, I said to a friend of mine recently, I can't see, I can't hear. Luckily, I'm still driving.
Okay, I wouldn't tell too many people that.
Yeah. No, looks good. Looks good.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your talk. I learned an enormous amount and for giving us your time. You're extremely generous. And thank you from everybody at ISGAP and from the panel as well, and all the participants, I'm sure. We have a number of other seminars coming up, so I would encourage everyone, and Professor Medzini, please do also drop in as well and give us your thoughts.
I've seen them. Thank you for your attention and your kind words of introduction. All the best.
All the best. Thank you very much, Professor. Goodbye.
Bye.